So did you just install a new exhaust system on your Harley Davidson? I recommend you keep that header pipe. Many people throw it away. But here's the thing, as the government cranks down on exhaust manufacturers, I think the header pipe is going to be the component hardest to find in the future. So whether you plan to trade your bike one day for possibly another touring bike, or you just want to maybe make some money, I think there's going to be a market for these stock header pipes before long. In my case, I'm about to trade my 2018 for a 23, so I'm putting the stock one back on it so that I can keep my modified header pipe for my new 23 CVO. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to swap this out. Join me. So why would you want to replace your header pipe anyway? Well, the header pipe, at least on a Harley Davidson, is where the catalytic converter lives. And as we know on our cars, catalytic converters are quite valuable. I don't think they're being stolen off motorcycles for the material in them. But what I'll say is they do rob your bike of power often, and they certainly rob it of sound, which is why many end up replacing it. But for me, it's the heat. A catalytic converter generates a ton of heat. And on a Harley Davidson, it sits under your leg. So a lot of people complain that motorcycles, not just Harley Davidson, are extremely hot. Well, often it's not so much the motor as it is this nasty catalytic converter buried down inside the pipe. So changing out your header pipe and the mufflers is really not complicated at all. It's just kind of a pain in the ass. There's a lot that can get scratched. There's a lot of painted parts and metal parts that you got to be careful with. So I always recommend you take your time and cover up areas that you're working at. But the exhaust is long, so you got to remember the exhaust, it goes all the way across. So if you're moving parts around, that means the other end's moving, so you got to coordinate your moves as you pull that exhaust off. Also, don't take a shortcut. Don't try it. You're just going to end up failing. If this is something you do frequently, then you'll learn how to hold it, how to twist it to get it off, and you can maybe not remove all the parts and save yourself a lot of time. But that's for someone who does it frequently. For a novice, I would recommend you take all the parts off. Don't try to leave something on, you're going to fail. So when you're doing this, you're definitely going to start by taking the mufflers off. You're going to take both sides off. Sometimes you can get away with the other side on this because the crossover is underneath, but I recommend you're going to have to at least loosen it and then hang it with a cord maybe. But you're going to want to take the muffler off. This is not easy. These are heat cycled many times if your bike is not brand new, and they are hard to get off. So you're going to end up wiggling that quite a bit. And then you're going to come up and you're going to end up taking the heat shields off. Yes, take the heat shields off. Many say you can take it off without doing that. It is possible. I've seen it done. But if you've got a finished heat shield like you do on this bike, or a nice chrome one with no scratches on it, you better take these off. So take your time, take them all off. Your floorboard. The floorboard should also come off. Can you wiggle it out of there? Maybe. On the CVO, we have the longer board, which makes it even harder. So take this board off, take the heat shields off, take the mufflers off, and then disassemble in order with all the clamps and go slow. Take your time and you can get this done. But this job is simple. It's just a pain, but you can do it. So if you change out your exhaust system, do you need to get it tuned? Well, if you're going to replace the whole system, including the header pipe, you got to remember you're removing that catalytic converter. And that's where a lot of the back pressure and restriction comes from. So you're going to allow a lot more air out of the system by changing that. And you could run the risk of running the bike very lean. It already comes lean from the manufacturer, and now you've removed all that back pressure, so it can run very lean, which can be very damaging to your heads. So I highly recommend if you're going to change your header pipe, you better have a tuning option ready to go. However, if you're just going to change the mufflers, you're not changing that restriction by very much. So I don't have any concerns at all by changing the mufflers and running the stock tune on the bike. You'll be just fine there. So on a CVO, you have speakers in the saddlebag. So the wires from this speaker go through the bag and connect. So the Harley provides a quick connector that allows you to pop that loose so you can quickly disconnect the bag. I think it's a good design. I will say one time as I was reconnecting it, I managed to push some of the pins through the connector and the speaker wasn't working. But I just found the connectors had been pushed through, pushed them back, have been good ever since. So this system has worked well. It'll be interesting to see what it looks like on the new ones. But here it is on the 2018 CVOs. You have this connector here in yellow. And you just reach down and pop that guy up. You need some fingernails to do it. Pop it up all the way. And that connector comes free and your bag is now able to come off. All right, so dealing with worms clamps. It's a 5/16 and you're gonna find where it connects. There's a screw and you're gonna unscrew it. You're gonna have to unscrew it all the way so it disconnects so you can pull the part off. Now when you pull the part off, you need to be careful that you're not rubbing, as these parts are, these worm clamps have now expanded and they can rub and scratch the paint. Now in this case, I've got the muffler loose, but there's a lot of friction here because this one's still tight. So I need to loosen this before I can pull this off. If I forced it, I'm likely to bend or scratch it. All right, so with that loose now, I can pull this part off. So I'm gonna turn it slowly, watching these loose ends that we don't rub or scrape on anything painted. You can see these are hairy when they're undone. So as you're pulling stuff off, these are rubbing on different parts. You need to be careful with those. The floorboard is just 2 bolts, 5/16. So now we're ready to take the muffler off. So here is the muffler clamp right here. The socket is underneath. It's actually a number 15. That will fit on there perfectly. It needs to be a deep socket because this is a long bolt, so you got to be able to reach it. Then you're going to remove the 2 1/2" on the holder here. And then you're going to tug for your life because these can be super hard to get off. We'll see if we get lucky. So pulling the muffler off can be a challenge. Sometimes they really stick. So you can use silicone spray or any type of WD-40 to help break this connection up. Also, I wanted to call it, you do not need to remove the muffler clamp. You just need to get it loose and get it off where it connects. So I recommend you have gloves. I didn't manage to grab any, so I'm gonna go without gloves. And you're just gonna grab and wiggle up and down, side to side, and keep pulling. With any luck, it'll come off. Also might keep your bike in gear so it doesn't roll backwards on you. I don't think mine's in gear. I'm gonna put my foot on the tire. We're just gonna wiggle, wiggle, up and down, side to side. This one's not fighting too bad. This is coming off actually really nicely. And there we go. I would say that one was pretty good. These can be a real bear to get off. Now we'll go after the crossover pipe. We've got a 9/16 muffler clamp and then a 1/2" bolt on the hanger. So we'll loosen these 2, take this one completely off, and then we'll go to the other side. So on this side we got 2 1/2", just like the other side, to remove the holder. We are going to remove the chrome cover so we don't scratch it. And then in theory, once we loosen these 2 guys, this whole part can wiggle off. But if it fights you too much, you may need to disconnect these 2 parts, but you would have to reconnect that hanger so it would hold it in place, allow you to wiggle this off. But I'm pretty confident we can get this piece off as one component. But again, I may regret it. So it's always better to take all the parts together when you're dealing with an exhaust. But let's see what happens. All right, so remove this last 1/2 inch that's holding the hanger on and put a foot underneath the muffler. Always keep the washer with your bolt so you don't look for it later. I still have the heat shield on the muffler, but I removed the heat shield down here at this connection where we're going to be wiggling around. So we'll be careful, and we're going to go slow and wiggle. And there we go. Okay, so our next step is to remove the oxygen sensors. We want to get those disconnected before we start removing the header and wiggling it out of its spot, because those cords are attached to it and we won't be able to get it off. So what we're looking at is there's an O2 sensor screwed into the header pipe right there, and then there's another one screwed in right here. So you have two choices. You can either unscrew them in place, which you'll end up putting a little bit of twist on the wire, or you can disconnect them behind the plate here and then fish the wires out and then remove the header pipe with the wires attached, unscrew them, screw them in the next header and put them back on, and then route the wires back. Take some pictures so you know how those wires route. It's really not complicated. You do want to make sure you get the front and the rear and the right connector behind this panel. Let's take a look at where those connect. To remove the panel, just pop up from the bottom, and then there's two connections at the top. Make sure you set this part down facing with the painted side up so you don't scratch it. And then what we're looking at are these two connectors right here. So here is your two oxygen sensor connectors. So you would disconnect here, and then you follow cut the zip ties, take note where the zip ties were, and then those two wires are right here, and you just feed them back through till they're both free to remove the header pipe, and then deal with the oxygen sensors with it off the bike. Just take some photos so you remember how they route and which color goes in which one. So the gray color is up front and the black is in the back. They make it fairly straightforward. Otherwise, you can just twist these off. You can put an open end box wrench on them and twist them off. But when you go to put them back on, you want to twist the opposite direction, the equal amount of turns. And so when you screw it on, you're not leaving it with a lot of tension. I opted to just twist it off, but I did pull this cord loose, so I had plenty to work with. So if you pull the sheathing back, you can see you're working with several wires. And when you twist them, you put a lot of tension on them, and you really don't want to break one that goes into this housing. The other thing is you want to be careful not to touch the sensor part. You don't want the oils from your fingers on these. It's also, I recommend you don't clean them. I've heard that. I think if you used a nylon brush or whatever to dust them off, that might be okay, but I choose to not mess with them. So you don't want to touch them, keep them clean. And if you're going to twist it off like I did, make sure you have plenty of slack to work with so you can don't get too much tension here at the connection point. All right, our next order of business is to loosen the where the pipe connects to your cylinder head. So there's a bolt on this side and a bolt on the other side. This is a tight space and difficult to get to. So here's the trick. So those bolts are 1/2 inch. So you're going to want a short version. You don't use a long one. And then you want an extension rod, fairly long, but if you notice at the end, it's a wobble end. So if you don't have one of these, well worth running to your big box store and picking one up because you're looking for a wobble end. So if you put your socket on there, and you don't put it all the way. So if you put it all the way, it's locked in, but you can go a little out, and now it wobbles. And this will allow you to get in there and twist those two bolts out. All right, once I broke them loose, I like to do this by hand. You want to be very careful not to strip these. Those go into your cylinder heads, and they are a big expense to replace with a lot of tools. So do the last part by hand. And then when we assemble it, we'll do the same thing. We'll feed them in there by fingers to start, and then the same method using it by hand. All right, so the front one's even tighter than the back. I like to put some glue or a painter's tape or any tape. You could use a towel as well along this frame rail because it's such a tight squeeze. And this is again where that wobble on the end of your socket is going to help you. So we're going to go underneath the header pipe and we're going to wiggle it in there. You have to go turn a little bit to get it to seat. Make sure your socket is fully on that bolt, okay? So you can see it's touching the frame rail right here, but I have the tape there. And these are not on tight at all. So we're just gonna get it loose. Go slow, it's a funky wobble. You wanna be careful not to use any force here because you do not wanna strip it. Okay, we're ready to wiggle this header pipe off. So it's important to get these collars to come down. You wanna wiggle, wiggle, wiggle till you get them to fall down on both sides here, because that way as you're pulling these away from the motor, you don't get them jammed up against the engine. And you can really scratch these beautiful fins if you do so. So get them loose, get them below. I removed a 1/2 inch down here on this clamp. So that will just, this clamp is actually in 2 pieces, so it may separate. So we're just gonna start wiggling carefully. And now we get one side out, the other side out, and you can see I'm very careful pulling straight out, not touching any parts of the motor. And look at that. Our header pipe is off the bike. Before we put the exhaust back on, we want to take a look at the exhaust gaskets. So most people will say that you can reuse them at least once. Some will say once or twice. So these were reused when I put my aftermarket header on. And what happens here is the pipe goes in and crushes this material to create a tight seal. This has been crushed twice now, and it's looking good. There's no damage, so you might be able to reuse it. But it is pretty thin where it crushes up against the cylinder head. So I'm thinking I'm going to replace them. So we have a couple of options here. So you can get the stock ones, and this is what they look like. They're rather difficult to put in without damaging them as you put them in. I usually put a little grease around the outside, and then you find a socket that's equal in size and just gently tap them in, or often you can just get them in with your finger running around carefully. That works well. It will generate a lot of smoke when you first start the bike because that grease is going to burn off. The other option is you can go with the Screaming Eagle. So these are really thin and they just kiss the surface, but they're super easy to install, right? Because there's not a lot of material to work with, and then they smash down against this. This also gives you a lot of room to maneuver the head pipe in. So these I find are a good option. But I'm going to replace these. So you use a hook and just pull them out and then pop the new ones in. We're ready to reassemble. So you just basically go in the reverse order. It is important to note none of these bolts require any significant force in bolting them down. And if you've got your service manual, you can get the torque values. So a couple of quick ones. The header flange, you want to start with the rear one first. So you're going to start with the rear connection of the header pipe first. And then you're going to go on the bottom bolt 9 to 18 inch-pounds. And then you'll go the top 100 to 120 inch-pounds. And then the bottom 100 to 120 inch-pounds. So those bolts are on very loose. They do not require a lot of torque. You're just seating them in. So after you get it all going, if you hear maybe some hissing from where they're connecting, you can go a little further. But you do not want to torque those down with any real force at all. And you'll start with the rear one and then go to the front one. All right, the side hanger here where the header will hang off, that is only 15 to 20 foot-pounds, not inch-pounds. The muffler clamps, the one that handles the crossover pipe, that is 38 to 43 foot-pounds, and same for the other muffler clamps. The tranny hanger that holds the hanger that holds the crossover pipe underneath the tranny, that one is only 14 to 18 foot-pounds. The floorboard, 36 to 42 42 foot-pounds for your floorboard. So those are your torque values. Again, nothing is super torqued here. Do not start cranking down on anything. Start at the front, work your way back, other than they have you bolt the rear bolts on, torque those down first, then torque the front, but keep everything loose. So you're gonna keep everything loose till you get it all on the bike, and then you'll start here, torque, go to there, torque, and then torque your way through the system. It's very important to keep things loose because you're gonna need to adjust as you assemble the header pipe and the mufflers back on your bike. All right, to prep the header pipe to go back on the bike, we've got to move over the exhaust flanges and the retaining clips. So you'll see these little retaining clips here. You're going to pry those off. A flathead screwdriver or a circlamp will work here, and then that will allow this flange to slide off, and then you will transfer that to the same place on the header pipe going back on the bike. So just get the prongs between the two, give it a squeeze to expand the ring, and then just guide it off the header pipe. And there you go. So when you're installing these, you want this channel facing up so that clip prevents it from sliding off. Okay, I've wiggled the header pipe back on. A couple tips. So I run the flange bolts in by hand. So I get my fingers started and get them started by hand. I don't use any tool whatsoever. You do not want to strip these, and you don't really want to drop them either. So you can squeeze your fingers in on this side and spin, and using your other hand to hold the bolt. That's the way to get these started, both of these by hand. Then make sure the bracket makes it onto the mount, because if it doesn't and you've got these started, you won't be able to pull this out enough to get that bracket on. So you want to make sure this is on before you start putting those in by hand. Again, start by hand and then run it in by hand with your wobble, and just get them to touch each. And then you'll do your torque sequence on the back and your torque sequence on the front. But I would wait until you have the rest of the system on before you tighten everything down. All right, if you do drop a bolt, ask me how I know. A magnetic reach tool is the way to go. Very strong magnet on the end will retrieve that bolt. Okay, we got the exhaust system back on. It just takes time and you have to do a lot of wiggling, so keep everything loose. And I really work from front to back. The other thing I wanted to call out is this crossover pipe here. This crossover pipe was really tight. It did not want to join the new header pipe. So one thing to note is you'll see the connections here have slats in them. There's a slat here and a slat here. So you can put a screwdriver in there and widen those up just a little bit on both sides. Not a lot. You're not looking to stretch this a ton, right? You want it to still grip. So I had to do that, and then I was able to get it started. Once I had it started, I was able to wiggle it on. So everything is loose, and I've got both mufflers attached on both sides. Both mufflers are attached, so I know that they align really nicely from the top. They align really well, but everything is loose. So now what we're going to do is torque everything down. So we'll torque everything to spec. I'm going to start at the front and work my way back. Okay, we've got everything torqued down, starting from the rear flange bolt, bottom, and then the top, and then back to the bottom, and then the front flange bolt, and then the mounting bracket, and the muffler clamps in order going backwards. So I wanted to call out with the muffler clamp. So this is what it is, and you're cranking down. There's this little bridge piece right here in the center. So you want to make sure that's aligning when it clamps together. But in here, there's a little filler piece right here, and this filler piece can twist sometimes. So you want to make sure that that's in alignment when you go to crank this down. Otherwise you'll get it'll torque on you, but it'll be twisted and you're really not sealing. So you do just torque these down. You don't need to go crazy cranking on them to seal them. Very important to remember to put these on in the right places before you get the exhaust assembled. Otherwise, you got to disassemble it to get this in the right spot. Ask me how I know. Fortunately, doing it once, you generally don't do it again. So that's my tips here putting together. I did start the bike, and you want to pay close attention to the sounds from where the header pipe is exiting the engine and see if there's any hissing sound at all, or any air sounds, an air type sound. That would indicate that your seal is not good. So it all sounds good. It's back to completely stock with the catalytic converter in place. Now we'll put the heat shields on. All right, the last step, the floorboards, 36 to 42 foot-pounds. There's just 2 bolts. You do use blue Loctite on these. When you screw these in, make sure you're putting, pulling up on the floorboard. This bolt should run in smoothly. If not, it's probably because you don't have the angle correct, and it's a little tricky to hold it in the right angle. So if it's not spinning smoothly, move your adjustment of your floorboard. It should go right in. You do not want to strip those bolts. And again, there are 2 of them, right here and here. So you can just hold the board so they go in smoothly. I always start them by hand. That completes the swap of our exhaust, though all we were really doing is swapping the stock header back onto the bike, taking the aftermarket one off. So not a difficult project. It's really rather simple. It's just it's a pain, right? A lot of metal parts, a lot of laying on the ground to get the bolts are hard to get to. Just take your time. So I started this video off warning you not to take shortcuts. And what did I do? I tried to take the left pipe off here without removing the connector pipe. Well, I ended up just taking the connector pipe off because it was much easier to wiggle it back in place. So do as I say, not as I do. Take all the parts off. It's way easier. Take your time and don't over crank anything. These are not high torque values. I think that's a common mistake, especially with exhaust systems. We just want to crank down because we don't want any air leaks, or it's got to be firmly mounted to the bike because it shakes. Don't crank stuff down by hand. Use a torque value, and if you're not, don't go as far as you think you need to. Go a little less. I think that's a common mistake. Until next time, in the friction zone.